Welcome to the Tobacco Online Policy Seminar, TOPS. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Danny Lee, a PhD candidate in health behavior research at Keck School of Medicine, University of Southern California. TOPS is organized by Mike Pesco at the University of Missouri, Shen at The Ohio State University, Michael Darden at Johns Hopkins University, Jamie Hartman-Boyce at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and Justin White at Boston University. The seminar will be 1 hour with questions from the moderator and the discussant. The audience may post questions and comments in the Q&A panel, and the moderator will draw from those questions and comments in conversation with the presenter. Please review the guidelines on tobaccopolicy.org for acceptable questions. Please keep the questions professional and related to the research being discussed. Questions that meet the seminar series guidelines will be shared with the presenter afterwards, even if they are not read aloud. Your questions are very much appreciated. The presentation is being video recorded and will be made available along with presentation slides on the TOP website, tobaccopolicy.org. I will turn the presentation over to today's moderator, Mike Pesco at the University of Missouri, and also Justin White from Boston University to introduce our speaker.
Today we continue our summer 2025, apologies. Today we continue our summer 2025 season with a single paper presentation by Jonathan Livingstone-Banks entitled Interventions for Smokeless Tobacco Cessation, a Cochrane Review. This presentation was selected via a competitive review process by submission through the TOPS website. Jonathan Livingstone-Banks is a lecturer and senior researcher in evidence-based healthcare at the University of Oxford. He's an expert on evidence synthesis, primarily working on tobacco control topics, and he's a member of the Cochrane Tobacco Addiction Group, where he was managing editor and information specialist, and the Oxford Tobacco Addiction Group. He has authored over 20 Cochrane reviews on tobacco control topics and is always eager to discuss a new evidence synthesis project. Dr. Livingstone-Banks, thank you for presenting for us today.
Hello. Right, it is a pleasure to be here. Just let me set up my slides. Okay, is that visible to everybody?
Yes, they are.
Marvelous. Okay, well, thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure. So yeah, I'm John, and I'll be talking to you today about a systematic review that we conducted looking at smokeless tobacco products and how we can best help people to quit using them. Before I start off, just a big thank you to my collaborators on this. So I worked with a range of wonderful and clever people, mostly based at the University of York, I think, with a few exceptions. You can see their lists in the author list there on the slide. Without them, wouldn't have been able to actually make this piece of work happen, as we'll see in the next slide. As we will see in the next slide. There we go. This piece of research had no funding. This was a little bit of a passion project, which was conducted entirely off of goodwill from people who were willing to pitch in and help with getting the work done, despite there being very little reward for it. So very grateful. There are no conflicts of interest to report for this piece of work, as no funding was received as well. As was mentioned in the introduction, I'm a member of the Cochrane Tobacco Addiction Group and an associate editor for Cochrane, where this was published, but I was not involved in the editorial process for this work at all. 3 of the authors of this review were responsible for conducting one of the trials that was included within it, but they had nothing to do with the data extraction or evaluation of that study, as per best practices with Cochrane systematic reviews. So the topic for this work is smokeless tobacco products. As you can see there, I've got a little asterisk by smokeless tobacco because I think probably the first couple meetings that we had to discuss this work were dominated by discussions of whether or not smokeless tobacco is in fact really the right name for this family of products. By smokeless tobacco, what I'm going to be talking about is the range of tobacco products that do include tobacco itself, that are either chewed or held in the mouth or dissolved in water or snorted, anything that doesn't involve combustion, with two notable exceptions. This does not include heat not burn, sort of heated tobacco devices, which heat tobacco to release a vapor, but with no combustion. And nor does it include e-cigarettes, which some people might consider to be a smokeless tobacco product, given that they don't create any smoke. These are not what I'm going to be talking about today. Today, I'm going to be talking about what we might more traditionally have safely called smokeless tobacco products. That being said, they are a very diverse range of products. They are used by over 300 million people across the world in various forms. They are most prominently used in South Asia and Southeast Asia, where they're very common, but they're also strongly associated with Northern America and the Nordic countries as well. They are a very diverse family of products. They come in different forms, from snus, which is little packets of tobacco, to chewing tobacco, which is sort of often just loose tobacco leaves, but also many of the South Asian products will be wrapped in leaves or other kinds of packages. Some come in pastes or powders. And they have a range of different ingredients as well. So some will be much more pure tobacco. Others will be mixed with a variety of ingredients, things like areca and betel, which are nuts and leaves that get combined in South Asian and Southeast Asian products. Also slaked lime and various flavorings. And with all of this variety of products, comes with a variety of usage patterns. So some of them are held just under the lip and left there. Others are chewed and spat out. Others are even dissolved in water or snorted. They also come with different health effects because they're also produced in different ways. So things like Scandinavian snus will be produced to factory conditions. And of these products is probably one of the safer ones, whereas many of the products used in South and Southeast Asia will be made by cottage industry. So they'll be made by a local person, mixing ingredients by hand that they've acquired in the local community. And this can have an impact on both their addictive properties, but also their health. It's also worth noting some of those ingredients that get included, things like the areca, the betel, the slaked lime. They can impact both how addictive the substance is. For instance, slaked lime affects the pH, which can then affect how much nicotine is absorbed. And they can also have health impacts in and of themselves, because they're also largely unregulated as well. In terms of how we might help people quit using these products, there's a range of different interventions available, and all of the potential interventions here are pretty much the same as the potential interventions we might think of when we're looking to help people quit using combustible tobacco, so smoking. These can involve nicotine replacement therapy treatments, pharmacotherapies like varenicline or bupropion, but also behavioral interventions like counseling, brief advice, or community interventions as well. It's worth noting that these products and interventions to help people quit using them receive a lot less attention from the research community. So just for a little bit of context, in the Cochrane library, there are over 90 different systematic reviews looking at different tobacco control interventions focused primarily on combustible tobacco. There is only one systematic review in the Cochrane library looking at smokeless tobacco, which is the one I'm going to be talking to you about today. So we set out to conduct a Cochrane systematic review. For those of you who don't know what a Cochrane systematic review is, a systematic review is a research product where we combine all of the available evidence that addresses a specific research question, and we try and bring out answers that are greater than the sum of its parts. So you learn more than you would from just reading those individual studies by themselves. And Cochrane are considered to be the gold standard when it comes to systematic reviews. They have the most rigorous standards and are the most demanding to complete. Our goal here was to replace a previously published Cochrane review. So there was a review on this topic that by this point was out of date. It was a good 10 years out of date, I believe. And the current author team weren't in a position to update it. So we took that on and we conducted this entirely from scratch. So we started from the beginning again, because we also wanted to update the methods to reflect modern best practice. Our goal was to assess any intervention for helping people quit using smokeless tobacco. And we also wanted to try and explore if the effectiveness of these interventions varies based on what products or where they are. So trying to reflect some of that variety and diversity in these products, if that affects how easy they are to quit. We defined our research question using the PCOS acronym. So when we were judging whether or not to include studies in our review, we were interested in a population of any users of smokeless tobacco products. We were also interested in dual users of combustible tobacco, so long as they were still smokeless tobacco users. The interventions were any intervention, so long as it was intended to help people quit using their smokeless tobacco, compared with either a placebo, some other eligible intervention, or no treatment at all. And the outcome of interest for us primarily was abstinence from all tobacco use at 6 months or longer. The reason why this is all tobacco use as opposed to just smokeless tobacco use is because we didn't think that this would be a real benefit quitting using smokeless tobacco if you've only switched onto smoking cigarettes instead. So we really were only interested in if people have genuinely quit using any form of tobacco at all, though we did still include data if a data from a study was only based on smokeless tobacco cessation. And the studies that we were interested in were randomized controlled trials. For our methods, as I said, this was a Cochrane systematic review, and we followed Cochrane methods. So these are the strictest methods for this kind of research. I won't belabor the steps that we follow too much, but I'm very happy to answer follow-up questions. If anyone wants to know more about a specific thing, I can fill in on the details. Some of the important things that I think are worth highlighting is that this was all based on a predefined protocol that we published in the Cochrane Library in 2022. We followed best practice from the Cochrane Library standards, PRISMA, which is a set of reporting guidelines, standards set out by the Cochrane Tobacco Addiction Group, and also the Russell Standard, which represents some of the best practice for smoking cessation research. We conducted systematic searches of a range of online databases of research, and we did that up to, or from conception, right up to the 16th of February 2024. So we concluded all research that was conducted up to that date. We screened, extracted, and appraised the methodological quality of all of those studies based on best practice, which means doing all of that in duplicate, 2 researchers from our team independently screening, and then in the subsequent steps, data extraction and risk of bias assessment, doing that independently from one another and resolving any discrepancies by discussion. Once we had all that data, we brought it together in our synthesis, we conducted a narrative synthesis, writing up the characteristics of studies and also the findings. And then the cool bit is that we got to conduct a meta-analysis. So that's a statistical pooling where we combined the results of many of those studies together to get us more reliable answers. We then used the grade methods to ascertain the certainty of evidence for each of our main conclusions. For those of you who aren't familiar with grade, it's a tool by which we can judge not only what our findings are, but how confident we can be in those findings based on the evidence that's contributed to them. It's based on a set of factors, including the risk of bias of the included studies, how consistent the findings of those studies are, whether there's imprecision, how directly relevant the evidence is, and if there's any evidence of publication bias. Talking a little bit about our analysis methods. We conducted meta-analyses using Mantel-Hansel models to form risk ratios with 95% confidence intervals. We did this on an intention to treat basis, so that means that we judged participant outcomes based on the arms that they were randomized to, regardless of whether or not they received that intervention. And we considered anyone who was lost to follow-up to be continuing using tobacco. This is all within best practice. We planned some subgroup and sensitivity analyses to explore potential heterogeneity. We anticipated there'd be quite a lot of heterogeneity in this review, so variety in results. That's largely because of the sheer amount of variety there is in these products, in smokeless tobacco products. So we plan to conduct sensitivity analyses testing the effect of removing studies at high risk of bias, studies that didn't report abstinence from all tobacco use, but just from smokeless tobacco use, and ones where the population had a high use of areca or betel outside of the smokeless tobacco products that they were consuming. We also plan to subgroup studies within those analyses based in our attempts to try and explore the variety of these products and how that might impact on cessation rates. So we wanted to explore a couple of different ways of dividing these studies. So we were thinking based on either the geographical or cultural origin of the product, or also potentially based on what the ingredients of the product were. So the National Cancer Institute and Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have a classificatory system with 4 categories for smokeless tobacco products based on the key constituents that are in them besides tobacco. And so we hope to use that for further dividing these studies as well. That's all I have to say as a preliminary for the methods. That might be a good point to pause in case anyone has any questions before I plow on to what we've found.
Great. I am Justin. I'm filling in or taking over for Mike at this point. Thanks, Mike, for pitch hitting. So I want to remind everybody that you can put your questions in the Q&A. And I think to start off, we're going to turn it over to our discussant to have first shot at asking questions. And our discussant today is Dr. Benjamin Chafee, a professor from the University of California, San Francisco, where he studies tobacco use among adolescents and oral health across the life course. And so, Ben, feel free to ask any questions you have at this stage.
Yeah, thank you very much. And one, John, thank you for sharing your team's work and everything that went into putting this together. It's really excellent to have an updated resource on this topic. And thank you to the TOPS team for inviting me for a chance to share some thoughts today. And I'll just start out with an observation that carrying out a systematic review is really a time-intensive, thankless process in many cases. It just requires so much meticulous attention to detail. And every time I've engaged in a systematic review, we'll set out, here's our plan, here's our protocol. And then it always seems that there's unexpected complexities that come up along the way that make it take longer than you think it's going to take to finish. And John, maybe your team's done 20 of these now, from what I understand. This may be old hat, but I see it as a really extensive undertaking and want to thank your team for doing this. And not only a systematic review, but a Cochrane systematic review that just raises the level of, in some cases, rigidity in the rules you must follow. But within those rules, the idea is to advance the rigor of the process and come out with something we can really have confidence in the end. So it's mostly an observation, but if you have any thoughts just on the process and what went into it, or any general comments on what makes a Cochrane review different from your general systematic review, maybe you can take a minute or so on that.
Sure. I mean, first of all, thank you very much. It's very kind of you to say. I am blushing a little bit. So that makes me feel very warm inside. Thank you. And yeah, I mean, I certainly conducting systematic reviews, and especially Cochrane reviews, is a very it can be quite a big job, and it involves a lot of people sometimes. But I mean, I think it's great fun. I mean, I'm definitely a systematic review geek. This is what I do pretty much all day, every day. And I love the idea of being able to combine the work that people have already done to try and learn something beyond what you might get from those individual parts, hopefully. And certainly I've been in a very lucky and privileged position in that I was trained how to do this within the Cochrane Tobacco Addiction Group by my wonderful mentors, Jamie Hartman-Boyce and Nicola Linson, who are real geniuses at this stuff. So I mean, yeah, there's a lot of rules and there's a lot of methods involved, but there's also I think the real fun comes when you get to the tricky, complicated bits, and you've got to think critically about, well, actually, how do we bend the rules in such a way where you maintain that scientific rigor, but actually, as you say, where it's not too rigid and where you can actually still get valuable information and not get beaten by the book, as it were. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think as we get into the results, we can talk if any of those kind of instances came up when you tried to classify different studies and how to put quality around your conclusions. Is this moderate evidence? Is this limited evidence? Things like that. For now, though, I'll highlight something else you brought up at the beginning. You talked about smokeless tobacco being overlooked, and I'll agree with that strongly. And cigarettes clearly are still the main global killer, anywhere 8 to 9 million preventable deaths per year due to cigarette smoking. But smokeless tobacco, this family of products, is certainly meaningful. Here in the United States, if you look at the statistics, use of smokeless tobacco among adults is about 2% prevalence. But that underestimates, because we have such gender difference in the use of this product. It's almost predominantly male, at least in the US and many other settings. So it's really 4% prevalence of use of smokeless tobacco among men in the United States. And that's getting right up there with the prevalence of electronic cigarettes, which is maybe 5-6% among US men. And then when you look at a place like India, the most populous country in the world, overall among all adults, we're surpassing 20% prevalence of smokeless tobacco use, and higher again among men, maybe 25-30% among men versus 10-15% among women. So this is really a significant contributor to disease. Something that strikes me when you look at the statistics in India is that when you look at cancers by site, oral cavity cancer is right up there near the tops. In some studies, will suggest that that's the #1 cancer site among men. Some studies will put it #2 behind lung cancer. But much of that cancer burden, that oral cancer burden, directly traces back to use of smokeless tobacco. And as you mentioned too, the products are quite different. There's this heterogeneity in products and where they're used. And when you're talking about South Asia and Southeast Asia, these are really the most dangerous products. They have high levels of nitrosamines that are linked to causing cancer. You talked about the alkalinity of these products, allowing really rapid absorption or more absorption of nicotine that can make them more addictive. And so one irony of this review and where the evidence for cessation lies is that where the most dangerous products are being used at the highest prevalence isn't necessarily where we have the most evidence. You mentioned the previous Cochrane review that was published in 2015. At that time, every trial but one in that review was from the United States. And so I think I'll let you comment on this, if you see it this way, this mismatch between disease burden and evidence. where things stood 10 years ago with the review, where virtually all of the trials were coming out of the United States, and how things are different in this review 10 years later, where I know you haven't gotten the results yet, but maybe a little foreshadowing, where perhaps we have some better global representation, but maybe not quite yet where we'd like to be when it comes to covering the range of different products and the range of different geographies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly things aren't as much better as they ought to be. There are more studies now. We'll see on the next slide in the talk, I've got a breakdown of the studies that we found, and there are more in sort of South Asian countries, but it's still definitely not proportionate to the distribution of users, which is a shame. So the progress between between the last version of this review and this one is not what we might hope, but there is a bit of a silver lining in that in terms of the research that is currently underway that we identified. So I think probably the difference when we come to the next update of this review, I'm not sure when that will be, but hopefully sometime in the next few years, perhaps, I think the picture will be potentially a lot more reassuring.
Great. Ben, do you have any more questions at this stage?
No, I think we should probably dive in and start looking at these results.
Yeah, let's get to it.
Right on. Okay. So in terms of what we found, based on systematic searches of the databases, we came up with 43 randomized controlled trials, including between them just over 20,000 people. As Ben alluded to, there is still a significant skew in terms of where these studies are being conducted. So of those 43 studies, 33 of them were in North America, 2 were in Scandinavia, and only 8 were conducted in South Asia, or Turkey as well. So there is still definitely a skew. Things have come forward from the previous version of this, where there was only 1 study, but still not as representative as we would like, especially when we then think that these studies weren't all looking at the same interventions. So it's not like we can pool those 8 studies in South Asia and Turkey together and get a more reliable answer, because many of them were looking at different things. So we've got to split them down further than that. In terms of the interventions that they did look at, the main interventions that the studies looked at were various forms of behavioral support. So 21 studies looked at counseling interventions of various forms of intensity, and 7 looked at brief advice. So this is like where a clinician is kind of in quite a short period of time advising someone to quit using smokeless tobacco and maybe giving them a little bit of advice how, but it's not intensive at all. There were also some studies comparing pharmacotherapies, either with placebo or no medication. 11 trials looked at nicotine replacement therapy, and 2 looked at varenicline, and 2 looked at bupropion. Now, there were also a few other trials that looked at other interventions. So there were a couple that looked at things like yoga, workplace interventions, or comparing behavioral interventions of similar intensity with one another to try and determine which might be more effective. And there were also 2 trials that compared nicotine replacement therapy with tobacco-free snuff. I'm not going to focus on those ones because they were all quite small and marginal studies. I'm going to focus on the comparisons we have up on the screen here, as these also represent probably the mainstream options that we would think of as cessation aids, given the main players that exist in the smoking cessation arena. We appraised the quality of all of these studies using the Cochrane risk of bias tool, and these are the results of that. So in this figure, we can see the bias is broken down into different domains of bias, so representing different aspects of the methods of those studies. Green represents where a study was at low risk of bias, the methods were suitable that we wouldn't expect them to be biased. Red is where There is an issue with the methods, and we would expect there to be some high risk of bias. And unclear is where there was insufficient information in the study reporting for us to make a judgment one way or the other. The white sections are where a study wasn't appraised for that domain. So there are some domains that we didn't appraise all studies on. The bottom three are only relevant to cluster randomized controlled trials as opposed to individually randomized trials. So only a fraction of the trials had used that method. And the third from bottom, blinding of participants and personnel, we don't appraise that when it comes to behavioral interventions because it's impossible to blind for them. So it's impossible to rule out performance bias in that case. Based on the overall ratings for those studies, so if a study was at high risk of bias for one domain, then we classified it as being at high risk of bias overall. If it was not at high risk for any single domain, but it was unclear for one or more domains, then we ranked it as unclear risk of bias. And we only considered trials to be at low risk of bias if they were at low risk for every domain in the appraisal. So we can see here we only had 5 trials that we would deem as being safely at low risk of bias. 16 were unclear because of insufficient information, and 22 out of our 43 trials we deemed to be at high risk of bias because of various methodological flaws. And we took this into account then when we conducted our synthesis. Speaking of which, I don't know how well this will show up on your screens, but I'm going to talk you through it anyway, so you don't necessarily really need to see the forest plot here. Our first comparison is grouping together studies that tested some form of cessation counselling compared with minimal support or usual care. So the results here did show a benefit. So there was an increased cessation rate amongst people randomized to receive counseling compared with those who were randomized to receive minimal support. What's notable here, though, is that there was a high degree of heterogeneity. So we assessed heterogeneity in these analyses using a statistic called the I-squared, which gives us a percentage. The higher the percentage, the more variation there is in the numerical results of these studies that goes beyond what we would normally expect and attribute to just variation by chance. So 69% is quite a large amount of heterogeneity, certainly worth exploring. And we tried various ways to try and explore this heterogeneity to see if we could get to the bottom of it and see if this pooling was really appropriate. Our planned subgroupings that we had hoped to be able to do, so the ones I spoke about earlier, based on the geographical distribution or the types of products, are really trying to drill down into those different types of smokeless tobacco and if that affects cessation rates. We weren't able to conduct any of those subgroup analyses because there wasn't enough variety in the studies that we had. So even though there's so much variety in the products that exist, that wasn't reflected in the studies. And this goes back to the points that Ben was making about how there is a skew in terms of the research that's been conducted. So we weren't able to explore the heterogeneity through that method. So we came up with some ad hoc ways of subgrouping based on characteristics of the studies which we thought might represent types of difference. So the one that's up on the screen here, we subgrouped based on the intensity of the counselling, so the number of hours of contact that the person would have with someone who's trying to convince them and give them support in quitting smoking. The other subgrouping we did was based on the modality of support. So for instance, whether it was face-to-face or over the telephone or some mix of the two. In both cases, we weren't able to get to the bottom of that heterogeneity. So based on what we've been able to do so far, that is still unexplained. So there is still a bit of a question mark as to whether or not it's appropriate for all of these studies to be combined in the same place. But we can take reassurance from the fact that while there is this high degree of heterogeneity in terms of the extent of the effect, if you look at all the points in the plot going up from top to bottom, you can see that the direction of effect for all of them is very consistent. So we don't have them scattered all over the place with some disagreeing or not on whether or not it helps. It really is largely disagreement on the extent of the benefit. And it's also worth noting that if we hold this result up again against the results that we have from behavioral support, or specifically for counselling to help people quit smoking combustible tobacco, those results look quite similar. So there's kind of comparable findings in that sense, though we should be very careful in terms of comparing the results of different meta-analyses against one another. But given that they're broadly in the same ballpark, we can be reassured by that, at least partially. We also combined results from studies testing brief advice compared with no support. And again, here we did find evidence of a benefit of more people quitting who had received that brief advice. There's still some evidence of heterogeneity. That I-squared statistic is at 49%. And also we do have confidence intervals here that while they're statistically significant, we may think that they include the potential for no clinically significant difference. So only very few more people quitting that may not be enough to then justify the intervention. So to summarize the results that we find here, we have a summary of findings table, and in the top row here you can see counselling versus usual care or minimal support. Our risk ratio was 1.79, with confidence intervals going from 1.44 to 2.16, and this is based on evidence from 21 studies, over 7,000 people. The absolute effect of that is that we might expect per 1,000 people for approximately 278 to successfully quit. We, using grade, ranked this as moderate certainty evidence. So the way that grade works is you start off at high, and then depending on certain flaws in the evidence base, you downgrade. So in this case, we downgraded because of that unexplained heterogeneity, that 69%. We couldn't explain it, so we felt that that represented a step back in how confident we could be in the findings. For brief advice, the risk ratio was more modest, but still comparable to what we might expect from brief advice to help people quit smoking combustible tobacco. The risk ratio was 1.24, with confidence intervals going from 1.03 to 1.48. This is based on evidence from 6,000 people across 7 studies, with an absolute quit rate of approximately 186 people per 1,000. We rank this as moderate certainty evidence. We downgraded because of that imprecision, because the confidence intervals included the potential for no clinically significant benefit. And while the majority of studies in this analysis were at high risk of bias, we didn't downgrade for high risk of bias, because when we conducted our sensitivity analysis, testing the effect of what would happen if we remove those high risk of bias studies, it didn't change the direction of effect. So we can be more reassured that those high risk of bias studies aren't skewing the result one way or the other. It's relatively stable for that. So that was our 2 comparisons for behavioral interventions. We also were able to pull studies on pharmacotherapies. So for our analysis looking at nicotine replacement therapy compared with either placebo or no medication, we did find a benefit with a risk ratio of 1.18. We did have some heterogeneity of an I-squared of 39%, which is still there, but not as concerning as with those prior analyses. And when we conducted a risk of bias assessment, removing those studies at high risk of bias, this did change the direction of effect. So there is potential that the high risk of bias studies may well be skewing the findings there. That's something that perhaps is worth exploring some more in the future. Notable here is that whereas the behavioral intervention results were broadly comparable with what we might expect based on the rates for same interventions for smoking cessation, the results here are less impressive than we've seen with nicotine replacement therapy as an intervention for smoking cessation, where the result here is 1.18 with confidence intervals going up to 1.33. For smoking cessation, the Cochrane review looking at nicotine replacement therapy has a risk ratio of 1.55 with confidence intervals that don't overlap with these. And again, we've got to be cautious comparing these things. We can't hold up and say it works better with one than the other, but it's certainly a bit of a question mark and something that we may want to explore with future research. We were also able to conduct very small analyses, pooling results from studies that compared either varenicline or bupropion versus placebo. In both cases, we had results again that were less impressive than their counterparts for smoking cessation. But again, we should be cautious with such comparisons. And also these analyses are based on very small analyses. We've got 2 studies each for these, whereas the equivalent analyses for smoking cessation have 40 or 50 studies in them. Worth noting is that while varenicline still shows a benefit, the current evidence doesn't necessarily support bupropion for helping people quit smokeless tobacco. To summarize these results in our table, for nicotine replacement therapy, we concluded that we had low certainty evidence of a benefit. We downgraded the evidence here because of risk of bias, because studies at risk of bias, when we removed them in our sensitivity analysis, it did change the direction of effect. And also for imprecision, because those confidence intervals do include the potential of no clinically significant benefit, even though they are a statistically significant benefit. For bupropion versus placebo, we found low certainty evidence, and this we downgraded 2 levels because of imprecision, and this was in virtue of, because it was such a small analysis, only included 293 people, and there were fewer than 150 events, so people successfully quitting, significantly fewer than 150. So in accordance with grade rules, we downgraded 2 levels for imprecision. For varenicline, we downgraded the evidence 1 level, again for imprecision. This was because there were fewer than 300 events, again, in virtue of the fact of what a small analysis this is. So to kind of bring all of that together in our conclusions, we can say that we have moderate certainty evidence that counseling and brief advice to quit are effective ways to help people quit using smokeless tobacco. We also have moderate certainty evidence in favor of using varenicline for this purpose. We have low certainty evidence favoring nicotine replacement therapy, but at the moment, low certainty evidence does not currently support using bupropion for smokeless tobacco cessation. Now, there are a few things we can draw from this in thinking about next steps and where we need to go next with the research. And as someone who does systematic reviews, I often find myself saying something to the effect of, we just need more primary research. So please, come on, folks, let's get a wriggle on. Let's do some more trials on this, please. If you need someone to vouch for you to do a trial, I will preach from the mountaintops of how important these trials are. Out of 43 trials that were conducted, only 8 of them were conducted in the populations where the usage for these products is highest. But there is a silver lining in that of the 22 ongoing studies that we identified in this review, so ones that haven't been finished and data isn't available yet, 20 of them were being conducted in these regions. So we can see a real shift both in the quantity of evidence being generated. Remember, that represents a 50% increase on what's already been done over however many years. But also it's now starting to be done in the right places as well that are most relevant to an international problem such as this is. For my sake, so that we can redo these analyses and actually get to the bottom of exploring the variety and heterogeneity amongst these products, I would really love it if people did more studies exploring the variety of these products, both transparently reporting what products people were using, and whether they were also using, whether they were dual users of smokeless tobacco and combustible tobacco, or if they used other products like betel or areca as well as their smokeless tobacco. So doing more work on this, but also transparently reporting. A lot of the studies didn't give us enough detail to work with. Also a point of interest, while there were 2 studies that compared tobacco-free snuff with nicotine replacement therapy as a way of quitting smokeless tobacco, as of yet, there are no trials that look at oral nicotine pouches as a way to quit using smokeless tobacco. Now, obviously, that's unsurprising. It's still very early days for those products, and we're still figuring out what to make of them and what role they may play in tobacco control or not. But it seems on an intuitive level that they may be an ideal product for helping people quit using smokeless tobacco products, given the potential similarities in the usage habits that we can imagine they have. Anyway, I'm very happy to answer further questions. Thank you very much for listening to me. I hope I didn't ramble on too long.
That was wonderful. Thanks so much. I want to just remind our audience that if you have any questions, you're welcome to put them in the Q&A and we can ask our speaker. And I will turn it back over to our discussant to see if he has any questions to get us started.
Thanks, John. That was really fantastic. I've got quite a few things that come to mind. I'm trying to decide where to start first. And why don't we jump in with one of these top line findings that's across these trials. Counseling was found with moderate evidence to be pretty effective at cessation. And as you said, that's a different finding than has generally been reported for cigarettes, at least in terms of the potential magnitude of the impact, both on a relative scale and an absolute scale. If you look at the percentage of individuals who quit with counseling versus comparison group, it's substantial, at least based on the studies that are in this review. So when I first asked by saying, is there anything particular about the content or the delivery of these counseling interventions that you think makes them well suited for smokeless tobacco or effective? I mean, you can think about counseling delivered during a health visit from a physician or a dental professional. You can think about counseling over an app or a quit line. What does the landscape of these counseling interventions look like? What was common across these studies, or was there anything in particular that stood out?
It's a really good question, and I think I should probably give the caveat. There's a bit of a limit on how much I can usefully say. I mean, certainly part of one of the drawbacks of being a systematic reviewer is sometimes you get a little bit long-sighted looking at studies, and you can be grouping things together without looking too much at the details, which are a lot harder to explore sometimes, especially when you don't have enough evidence to use some of the analytic tools to divide. But certainly one thing that's notable is that there were some of these interventions that were significantly more intensive. So some of them did involve like multiple hours of counseling extended over periods. And obviously these were all tailored specifically to be focusing on smokeless tobacco as well. One thing that is notable from our inability to get to the bottom of the heterogeneity in the meta-analysis is that there wasn't necessarily any kind of strict pattern based on intensity that you might expect to see. So, I mean, you might hypothesize that, well, it would make sense if the more intensive counseling interventions gave us better quit rates. And we didn't really see any kind of strict pattern for that in the data. Now, of course, there could be a range of different forms of variety that might explain that. So I wouldn't want someone to conclude, therefore, we shouldn't be giving more intensive counseling. I don't think we are in a position to conclude that at all. I think what we can conclude is that this approach is likely effective. It's probably helps. And what we now need to do is drill down onto the details. But I mean, insofar as what we can conclude from our work on what characteristics are more valuable than others, I really can't say based on the findings of our analysis, sadly.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, you're dealing with a relatively small amount of studies once you start slicing it by, hours of contact time. You may be trying to make a conclusion based on just, a handful of studies put together. And you're right. And you'd love to also look at all these different dimensions of splitting out the counseling. Who delivered it? I think about, how much is the message tailored in particular for smokeless tobacco and individuals who use smokeless tobacco. At least here in North America, the groups with the highest prevalence of smokeless tobacco use tend to be male, usually younger men, rural communities, identify as white, racially, ethnically, blue collar, politically, socially conservative. And so here's an audience that, for any cessation counseling, you want to be non-judgmental, you want to respect the autonomy of the individual, but if those aspects may be even magnified further in this demographic. I think about, you're probably familiar with the website killthecan.org, which is it's really supposed to be a support community, not from physicians telling people to quit, but from individuals who use smokeless tobacco who are on their own quit journey, trying to support each other and build community around that. And so these aspects of the counseling may be particularly important for a smokeless product.
Yeah, and certainly, so there's other work that I've been involved in. So on the combustible tobacco front, we conducted another Cochrane review where we're able to conduct a component network meta-analysis on behavioral interventions to help people quit combustible tobacco. And through that, we were able to really drill down on individual components and get some insights into what aspects may be more or less effective. So in theory, if we got to the point where there was enough evidence to be able to do that with smokeless tobacco, then we could drill down using evidence synthesis as a viable tool. But I mean, for context, that review for smoked tobacco, I think that had about 350 studies in it.
Yeah.
To be able to do that level of in-depth component network meta-analysis. So we're obviously still a long way from there for the minute.
Well, I'll turn from the findings for counseling for a moment and look at the findings for NRT, nicotine replacement therapy, which weren't particularly impressive. There was not strong evidence that nicotine replacement therapy can help people to quit smokeless, which is, you mentioned it too, there's a little bit of a reversal from what you see for combustible products, where pharmacotherapy and nicotine replacement are more effective than counseling. At least that's where the evidence seems to lie. But one thing that came out of the previous Cochrane review in 2015 was that if you split by method of NRT, there's at least some indication that nicotine lozenges may be more effective than other forms of nicotine replacement. And the authors of that review, they were cautious around. They say, look, this is based on 5 studies only. There's still a wide confidence interval. If you remove certain studies based on not having a placebo, then the results are a little bit different. But it made intuitive sense. It said, look, you've got a smokeless product that people hold in their mouth for a slow release of nicotine over time. Here's a lozenge that in some ways approximates that behavior. Maybe that could be a reason why this looks more promising. I don't think there's necessarily any new trials since that last review came out, but was that something that you looked at, that you've thought about, that maybe would encourage more research on because it seemed promising?
Yeah, I mean, I've got to hold my hands up. I mean, we didn't explore that. We didn't really think about that, and that is, I think, probably a legitimate oversight on our part. And I think there's a compelling hypothesis there. And obviously, sort of trying to match the usage pattern of the NRT to the habit is going to be a great approach. And certainly, if we can see more evidence on that, then yeah, I think that does sound like a promising kind of aspect to explore. And I think that's something we could definitely plan to explore in the next update of this review. One of the great things with Cochrane reviews is because they are these living documents, we get to update them periodically. We can take on board suggestions like that and really make that part of our next set of methods. And I think that's a great thing to do.
And it really speaks to one of the challenges for smokeless tobacco cessation. And you mentioned this in the beginning. Most of these trials are taking the same tools that have been tried and true for cigarettes and applying them to a different product. And we should be encouraging creativity to think outside that framework. Sure, we have a tobacco-based product that contains nicotine, but maybe there are some aspects of it, in terms of the rapidity with which nicotine reaches the brain, that we should be thinking about it differently in our approach to cessation. And certainly would love to see more trials thinking differently about this product.
Absolutely, yeah. I think a bit of imagination and really trying to start from first principles and thinking about what would be effective interventions, I think is going to be part of the way of really, sort of generating the right hypothesis based on potential mechanism of action that we can then test with trials. I think, yeah, that's exactly the approach.
You're not seeing a lot of activity in the Q&A. I'm going to give you one last question.
Oh, good. Go for it.
I saw you raise the topic of nicotine pouches, which is on a lot of our minds as they're a new product. And there's a few different ways we can think about what role these products may have in the cessation space. I mean, there's certainly the idea of a harm reduction paradigm. We take individuals who are using a presumably more dangerous, higher nitrosamine smokeless product and try to encourage them to switch over to a novel oral nicotine product like a pouch. And of course, then you've got to consider among your outcomes, dual use and long-term continued use of oral nicotine pouches. And then presumably there's also individuals who are using these pouches who would like to quit. They're highly addictive. They may not have anything for support or any evidence-based strategies to get off a nicotine pouch. So if you had to design just one trial, how and of course the answer is you want to look at both these things, you want to do it in different ways, but if you had to prioritize, where to put your funding, where to put your resources, what would a trial of nicotine pouches look like? What outcomes do you think would be, most important? How would you go about designing that?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question, and I think I would probably take my lead from the e-cigarettes research, because I mean I think the parallels are clear for everyone to see. I mean what e-cigarettes are to combustible tobacco cigarettes, oral nicotine pouches are to smokeless tobacco, or to many of the products anyways. There's certainly, if you're comparing them with something like snus, it's almost like a one-for-one comparison, really. So I think some of or pretty much all of the questions that come with oral nicotine pouches are going to be the same questions that we've seen come up with e-cigarettes, sort of about whether there are potential gateway effects, what the health impacts are, whether they are good for cessation as an intervention or as a population level product, sort of all of these things. So I think probably the main things that I would want to see from a trial, sort of beyond it being well conducted and well reported, and hopefully would be, I think, certainly looking at abstinence with a long follow-up, so certainly 6 months or longer, to be in line with what we would hope for from other tobacco cessation interventions, looking at what the long-term use of the study product is. So seeing, if at 6 months or a year, are people still using the oral nicotine pouches, even if they've successfully quit the smokeless tobacco product? And I think as well, probably the one different thing where this comes apart from what we might just expect, sort of mirroring the e-cigarettes research, is again comes down to the sheer variety of smokeless tobacco products, right? So, if we're thinking about oral nicotine pouches as a snus cessation intervention, then it's like basically exactly the same product almost. You could probably, trick someone into using them. I'm not recommending that anyway. But, comparing that with gutka or pan in South Asia, like they're very different products. Or even the chewing and dip tobaccos in America, like they have a different usage. So it would be interesting to see how acceptable they are, if they feel like the right fit for cessation. Or would people rather be using a pharmacotherapy or even an e-cigarette or whatever other intervention they might be interested in using? So I think while there are some smokeless tobacco products where OMPs are like the obvious intervention that we should be investigating, for others, we probably shouldn't be too complacent in assuming that it would be a good match. And we should probably do the legwork and actually figuring out if people would be interested in even using these products for that purpose.
So keeping my eye on the time, I think we probably have to leave it there. Clearly, this is an area where there's a lot more research needed, and so I appreciate your call for that. And why don't I turn it over to the MC, Danny, to take us out.
Thank you. We are out of time, so thank you to our presenter, moderator, and discussant. Finally, thank you to the audience of 68 people for your participation, and have a top-notch weekend.